Luigi Mangione will be in court tomorrow in Pennsylvania, where a source tells NBC News he plans on waiving his extradition to New York. If that happens, he'll be moved immediately to Manhattan, where he faces a slew of charges for the killing of Brian Thompson, including first-degree murder, which in New York involves an accusation of terrorism. Joining us now, NBC News national and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter, former assistant district attorney with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, and MSNBC legal analyst Catherine Christian, and former New York State Homeland Security advisor and director of Redland Strategies, Michael Balboni. He is the one who sponsored the New York State law on terrorism when he was a state senator. All right, Tom, I want to get the latest from you regarding the hearing and the investigation.
Yeah, a couple of different things here, Katie. So first off, as far as the charges, you've laid them out. You get that first-degree murder charge that also involves the terrorism, and I know we're going to talk about that. You've got the 2 second-degree murder charges. You've got a slew of gun charges, and then you've got the use of what we've been showing, and what we've been showing now for a week is that fake New Jersey ID, which apparently he presented to the hostel. So that's the information that we have as far as what's in here in the charges. Of course, almost nobody has the ability to carry a gun in Manhattan, so he was always going to face gun charges, plus the ghost gun charges. So that's been added to this as well, just so people understand how we got to this point. Now, I'm going to fold in some reporting from our colleague, Adam Reese. He's reporting that, yes, to your point, he's expected to waive that extradition. They'll definitely waive the preliminary hearing in Pennsylvania. Those 2 court proceedings scheduled to begin 8:30 and 9 a.m. So it's conceivable, because there really isn't a lot that has to be done on the Pennsylvania end. He could be in a car, presumably with NYPD detectives and members of the DA's office, on his way to New York City by mid-morning tomorrow. Wow. And then at that point, they're going to want to get him here, get him in a courtroom, arraign him, and that'll happen at the downtown state court, which is in Lower Manhattan.
Let's talk about the terrorism charge, because this really piqued my interest yesterday, and I'm just curious to go in a little farther on it. Michael, you co-sponsored it, or you did sponsor this legislation that added this on. Why does first-degree murder here in New York have a terrorism element?
Well, it was, at the time, it was really only limited to whether or not there was kind of other crimes, but didn't include terrorism itself. Terrorism now comes in after 9/11. I had sponsored the bill. Actually, ironically enough, Governor Pataki put a bill in the spring of 2001. Talk about being prescient. Amazing. So we passed it in the Senate, didn't pass it in the Assembly. Attacks happen. The legislature comes back in one session, joint session, and we pass it. The intent there, why I sponsored this, obviously in response to the attack, but it was also to try to recognize that this type of violence, that it was motivated by a need to change a government perspective, change a policy, that this could never be tolerated in the state of New York, and we should have the top penalty, which is at this point is life without parole. But back then we had a death penalty.
But this was in the aftermath of 9/11, which
right.
was a giant terrorist attack. Thousands of people
right.
died. It was genuinely terrifying, and we're still terrified of it in this country. I struggle to see how this single murder of a single person in the hours before the sun came up, when there was another person standing right by them, that person was able to walk away, how this single individual murder can be considered terrorism. And why second-degree murder, which also carries a maximum of life in prison, why that would not be enough?
At the time, again, we had the death penalty that was later struck down. Mm-hmm. So that was the intent, that you applied the death penalty to an act of terrorism. It's not so much what's in the law, it's more about what's not in the law. We didn't put in a requirement that there be mass fatalities or mass casualties. So we specifically said that if your motivation is to change the policy, practice of government, and you're going to use a violent method, and remember, it's not just murder. It's murder, rape, arson. There's a whole bunch of other things that you can use. And it is meant to coerce a unit of government, or a unit of, we say at the time, a unit of policy. That should be what is prohibited under the law.
Catherine?
Well, what you just said is what his lawyers, who I know, Karen Friedman, Ignifilo, and Mark Ignifilo, are going to say. The New York State Court of Appeals, 12 years ago, basically told the Bronx District Attorney's Office that a gang that terrorizes the way we think of terrorism, a neighborhood, that you can't charge this. So a little girl was murdered, a young man was paralyzed. New York State Court of Appeals says no. This was intended for, and they cited the state legislature, 9/11, the Oklahoma City bombing, it's for the 1993 bombing, it's for the yeshiva students who were shot at, and one was murdered on the Brooklyn Bridge. And appellate courts since have also said, no, it's really not intended for anything other than those very significant. Now, I'll be interested to see what evidence, because he will be arraigned and we will know more evidence.
Yeah, we're going to know more. I guess the reason why I'm so piqued by this is that I just wonder if it's a slippery slope when you're attaching a terrorism charge to individual acts. And yes, we're going to get more information and maybe have some more details on what he was writing and what he intended to incite here. But I wonder, there's a little bit of discomfort I have with the idea of charging this one person with an act of terrorism. It feels like you can use that in a very broad way in other potential scenarios.
Well, first off, I think just in keeping an eye on the law here, we are talking about a homicide or a very serious offense to Mike's point.
No doubt. No doubt about that.
But taking a step back, whether this law, and we've been having the debate, and the debate will continue to be had, whether this law is applicable here, whether it will survive in the appellate system, we were just speaking about it off air, to be determined. And my opinion on the matter is irrelevant. I will tell you, in law enforcement circles, I think there's a struggle here with the idea of what we saw this year politically in this country, 2 attempted assassination attempts on Trump, what we've seen in this particular killing, where people are starting to believe in society. You and I have spoken about this. The only way I can solve my problem is with violence, and the only way I can impact change in something, whether it be health insurance, political, whatever it is through these specific acts of violence. The potential for that to get out of control is very high. So maybe it's a law that needs to be, redrawn up. Is there an update that needs to happen? Does either the state or the federal government need to look at this and say, do we need a new law or something to talk about? But whenever somebody tries to attack ideology, and this is why I wonder where the Morales case, which you were referring to, is maybe a bit different.
I think that's really interesting that people are believing they need to take things into their own hands because the system is no longer working. On the flip side of that, you have Daniel Penny, who took a matter into his own hands on a New York City subway. There was a homeless guy who was scaring people on the train. He had suffered with mental illness. The city didn't do anything for him. He was out there struggling on his own. And in the moment where it felt unsafe on that train, Daniel Penny decided to take matters into his own hands and put him in a chokehold that prosecutors here in New York argued went on for too long and ultimately killed the man. Is there an interesting, I guess not parallel, but maybe parallel here regarding what we're seeing with the shooting of Brian Thompson, the United Healthcare CEO, and what Daniel Penny did?
I don't see a parallel there. I think what is very sad that there are people who are basically calling this alleged shooter, Mr. Mangione, sort of a hero because he shot in the back a healthcare CEO.
People call Daniel Penny a hero for trying to keep the subway safe.
But I think there are different facts than lying.
Well, I think they're different facts, but I think what I'm talking about is there is a belief that the system is not working, so Luigi Mangione took it into his own hands.
I think
Daniel Penny took it into his own hands.
There's a state of premeditation there, right?
Yeah.
So in other words, when Daniel Penny got on that subway that morning, was he expecting I hope somebody comes at me because today's the day I'm going to do it? I mean, that's why the parallels with the Bernie Goetz case don't necessarily apply. Whereas if the facts are true, as prosecutors and police have stated here, then I think, as it refers to Mangione, there's absolute premeditation if that's to be believed.
I think there are 3 differences that you can draw. One, on the Daniel Penny case, Article 35 of the penal law allows you to use physical force, deadly physical force, to stop deadly physical force being used against somebody else. So that's actually in statute. In terms of the Morales case, the fact that you had a gang in a shootout, they may have found that the overall community was frightened, but that wasn't the intent of the gang war. Here, what if a member of Al-Qaeda comes and assassinates a high-ranking official? Would that not be considered terrorism? Sure it would be. And that was in my mind when we enacted this statute.